So I was out in the woods and started thinking about Peanut the squirrel. And I'm not convinced the story we're told makes sense to me because they said that they had to euthanize the squirrel because they're concerned the squirrel had rabies. But I know I've in the urgent care before, I've had kids that were bit by dogs, and we didn't have to euthanize the dogs. We could observe the dog for 10 days. So I don't think we have the full story. So I'm going to do a FaceTime call with my sister, and I'm going to ask her. She's a veterinarian, she's an expert on this sort of stuff. I'm going to get her opinion about what's really going on here.
Well, that's the topic of today's Dr. Doodle.
For anyone not familiar with the story, Peanut the squirrel lost its mother when it was a baby. This guy named Mark took it in and raised it. It became a social media phenomenon and had tons and tons of followers on various platforms. Um, and then Mark used the money from that to make a kind of animal shelter, but he didn't really do it in the official legal way. He brought in this raccoon named Fred, and then things turned south. The New York Department of Animal Conservation or something like that came in and raided his house at the end of October 2024, and they ended up compensating the squirrel Peanut and the raccoon Fred. And then someone got bit, and then they end up being euthanized so that they could sample their brain tissue to see if either of them had rabies.
I was thinking, I was out in the woods and I was thinking about Peanut the squirrel. And my big question is, I don't think they told us the whole story because when I've had kids getting bit by dogs in the past, when I was working in the urgent care, we could observe the dog for 10 days for rabies, and they didn't have to euthanize the dog every time. And so what's going on? Couldn't they have watched this squirrel Peanut and watched the raccoon instead of just saying, "Oh, too bad, we're going to euthanize it right away"?
Yeah, and there's a couple things that people don't quite, I think, realize with it. So that 10-day quarantine period that we do after a dog or a cat bites a person is based on domestic animals in the US specifically, where we have a lot of data on um the strains of rabies that we have in the US are not designed to live in dogs or live in cats. We have a few different kinds of strains. There's ones that live in bats, there's ones that live in skunks, raccoons on the East Coast, and I think there's some for like foxes and coyotes out west. And so when those strains get in dogs and cats, within just a few days of when they're shedding the virus, your dog or your cat is going to get very sick and it's going to be really obvious. And so they do 10 days to actually be very safe. It's really usually within 2 to 3 days of starting to shed rabies that animal's going to be sick. But in wild species, we don't have a lot of data on how that virus behaves. Um, and so theoretically with Peanut, there's actually very, very low risk for human rabies exposure from most rodent species. So ground squirrels, squirrels, mice, rats, super low risk. The only exception to that is woodchucks for some reason like to carry rabies. But so the risk is low, but we don't know for sure. And the trouble is that rabies, is so serious if a person did get it, we can't take that risk. And then in Peanut's case, one of the big complicating factors is Peanut was living with an illegally owned wild caught raccoon that the people had raised. And that raccoon was from, I think it was Connecticut. It happened in New York, but I think he was from Connecticut. But regardless, he was from the East Coast that has that raccoon strain of rabies. And in the species that the strain is designed to live in, it can live for years and years and years before they start shedding it. And when they do shed it, they can shed it for quite a long time before they get symptoms. I was actually trying to do some quick research today and I couldn't find clear-cut answers, but it can be definitely more than 10 days. It can be up to months that they could be shedding the virus. So the trouble is, the raccoon friend Fred could have exposed Peanut. So even though normally squirrels aren't that big of a concern, Peanut had extra high risk because he was living with this feral raccoon. Um, and then he bit the person, and we really just don't have the data to be safe and say, hey, for sure, if that squirrel's not sick in 10 days, he didn't have rabies. We just don't know. The other big complicating factor is, quite honestly, Peanut was doomed because he was living with that raccoon. Because if that raccoon was positive, it would be a 6-month strict confinement with minimal exposure quarantine for Peanut, because he was exposed, because he was exposed to this raccoon strain of rabies. And so honestly, the state's not prepared to do that for a individual squirrel that wasn't really supposed to be owned anyways, under the conditions that he was being owned in. So that's some of his complicating factors, was that the human health risk. Do I think maybe they should have been a little more careful handling a wild squirrel so that you didn't get bit? Yes, but things happen. It's still a wild squirrel, and I'm sure it was a stressful situation. But once you have that human exposure, it's really not fair to be like, well, this poor guy that was just working for the DNR doing his job, and he was told to go get this squirrel, we might let him die from rabies, because we're just going to assume that the squirrel's fine. Well, that's not really a fair approach to human health. So the state can't make that call.
This clear cut is just like the typical dog that's living in someone's house. This is
exactly
like with that raccoon strain. It's kind of like a bat. Like, hey, there's a bat that if I had a pet bat flying around my house and I had a squirrel with it, like they're not going to go for that. They're like, hey, this is so dangerous. Because rabies is like, if you get rabies and don't immediately get vaccinated, you're done. You're dead.
Yeah.
If you show symptoms, you're dead, and it's a horrible, painful death. And so this is a situation where it's like it's a big problem. Like if they probably just had a squirrel, that wouldn't have been quite as exciting to the state health.
Yeah, the risk wasn't there if he hadn't been living with the wild raccoon. So,
because here's the thing is like, and I fell for it. Like I always say, like when I get like emotionally activated by watching stuff on TV or news or whatever, they're usually like telling me half the story. And usually when I explore it, I realize that maybe there's more to it. And it sounds like I kind of fell for getting emotionally involved in this when it sounds like, hey, if it was just some guy with the squirrel, it's like, hey, you can't do that. They're going to harass him. They're going to fine him and stuff like that. But bringing this raccoon from a different state that has this strain of rabies and also with it, I mean, it sounds like the raccoon, like they brought this raccoon in. And so if they're like, hey, I want my raccoon to play with raccoons outside, and then all of a sudden he spreads raccoon rabies to the New York state, like that's horrible. Like I mean, you could like I could see like spreading it to raccoons in the state, and then I could see some kid in the middle of the day like, oh look, there's a raccoon out in the middle of the day. They normally run away from most people, but it wants to be my friend. And the kid goes to try to play with a rabid raccoon that's wild and then gets bit. Now the kid's dead, And so I can see how it's like, too bad you can't do this.
Exactly. That's the it sounds like the state's just out to get the guy and kill his squirrel. But that's really not it. It's the public health concern of spreading these incredibly dangerous viruses that there's nothing we can do if you get rabies. I think like 2 or 3 people ever have lived, and they really weren't in that great a condition when they lived. And that's the big concern. So far we've kept the raccoon strain on the East Coast pretty well. Like I'm here in Michigan, we don't have it in Michigan, but there have been some people that illegally brought raccoons in. And it's been a big scare, because if it gets into our raccoon population, now it's here. And you can't go around vaccinating. It's easy to make a law and vaccinate most of the dogs in a state. You're not going to go around and vaccinate, even a small portion of the raccoons in a state. So it really is a human health concern. It's not the state just out to, screw over some poor raccoon. It really is a matter of like public health and public safety. And Peanut's owner, I think, kind of knew that, and he was just blowing it off. He'd had Peanut and the raccoon for quite some time. So really, I think, the one that lost here was the poor squirrel, where the humans didn't follow the regulations, didn't follow the laws. If he had wanted Peanut and the raccoon and kept them separate, Peanut probably would have been okay. But he just wanted to do whatever he wanted to do. And unfortunately that exposed Peanut, and then Peanut's the one that paid the consequences.
Stories don't bring wild animals across state lines. And then if you're making videos of stuff that's illegal, you're probably going to get caught.
That's probably just a bad idea. I personally don't recommend it. I know a few even veterinarians that have had pet raccoons, but I'll tell you what, I didn't even know they owned their pet raccoon until after the pet raccoon had passed. So they kept it quarantined. They didn't have people coming over hanging out with it, and they certainly didn't videotape it.
That I appreciate. That helps me understand things a whole lot better. I appreciate it.
No
And I'll
problem.
talk to you later.
See ya.
All right. All right. Bye-bye.